So welcome to today's webinar, Using the Model Solar Ordinance, a guide for Wisconsin communities. I'm your host, Jessie Bradish, and I'm a renewable energy specialist for UW-Madison Division of Extension. I work on RESET, and that stands for Renewable Energy Siting and Engagement for Tomorrow. And RESET is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy through the RSTEP program. And RESET helps Wisconsin communities like yours get ready, ideally before big solar or wind energy projects come to their communities. Right now, as you may know, these large renewable energy projects are being built across Wisconsin, and there's more on the way. But when developers arrive and there's no clear community plan, things don't always go smoothly, and that's why planning early is key. So we're happy to have you all here today to talk about some of the tools that RESET gives communities and the support that they need to talk through what matters most, what do you want, what do you not want. And so resources that RESET has to support these local governments and communities on topics include learning about solar land leasing contracts, educating landowners on what they should know before they sign, understanding the siting process, how does large-scale solar and wind siting work in Wisconsin, participating in public hearings and comments as a member of the public if there is a project, identifying your community's priorities and figuring out how to document them, like by adopting a solar ordinance, and also how do you negotiate with developers for additional contracts if there are projects. One of the best ways to document your community's priorities is with a solar ordinance. So today we're excited to have Bill Omican here to discuss the new model solar zoning ordinance. And Bill is many things, including Extension's local government law educator. And he developed this model ordinance with support from RESET collaborative members. So before we start the presentation, we would love to know who's on the call today. We got a lot of registration and interest, so we're going to launch a short poll right now to learn, where are you located? What role do you serve, if any, in your town or county or other jurisdiction? Do you have zoning authority in your community? Do you have any projects in your community? And have you passed or are you considering passing a solar ordinance? So if you could all participate in this poll as we transition the slides, and Bill, you're welcome to start sharing your slides now if you'd like. I'd love to just review the results of this poll here in a minute, and then we can move ahead to the main presentation. We have 11 responses. Yeah. Just give me 1 minute and we're going to just see what the results are of the poll. It looks like we've got some good coming through here. And as we're waiting for those results, I do want to mention, since there's so many people on today's call and Bill has a lot to present, we ask all questions be put in the chat. So let's let him get through the whole presentation, and I will facilitate a Q&A after the main presentation when Bill is finished. So we've got 33 out of 61. And I think that's a good, I'm going to end the poll now. So it looks like we have some county officials, some county staff, some town officials, some town staff, and some community members on the call. So good diversity. And some people don't have any projects, some are proposed, some are operational, some attendees are unsure about whether they have projects. The majority of the people that responded, Bill, do have zoning authority, so 85% of the attendee respondents. And the jurisdictions are all over the place about whether they've considered a solar ordinance or already passed one. So as you can imagine, a little bit of everything on today's call. And now I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Jessie. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Again, I'm Bill Omican, and just a couple other little bio tidbits is I used to chair the St. Croix County Zoning, Planning, and Parks Committee. So spent quite a bit of time working on zoning as a county official when I served on the county board up in St. Croix County. Also served on a town plan commission and also on a village plan commission. We don't want to, of course, leave out our cities and villages as well. And so welcome, everyone. And I'm going to be going through a series of slides. This presentation's really divided up into a couple of different pieces. And the first will be going through the guidance memo, which hopefully many of you have seen, but if you haven't, we'll be sending out links to all of these documents at the end of the webinar, so you'll certainly have access to it. And of course, we do welcome questions. And so I will go ahead and get started, and hopefully I can get my slides to move. I have to keep moving things around on my screen just to be able to facilitate that. But of course, we have to start out with the legal disclaimer. And sorry that we have to do this, but this is required by the University of Wisconsin, since I am one of the attorneys here at UW. They want to make sure that none of you think that we're giving direct legal advice. And so you always want to consult with your own legal counsel, competent legal counsel, and seek legal guidance as you go forward through the ordinance process. And so sorry again, I had to do that legal disclaimer, but it's required. So first thing I'm going to talk about is the solar regulation guidance. And as I said, that is a memo that we started distributing more than several months ago. And it was really meant to set the context for solar regulation in the state of Wisconsin. And so just by way of background very quickly, why are we talking about solar? And Jessie gave a little bit of an interview or a little bit of a background on it in her remarks, and I just want to provide a couple of additional things. In Wisconsin statute section 1.12, so at the very beginning of the Wisconsin statutes, there's a goal that's set. And the goal declares it's the state's official goal that all new electric generation capacity in our state be based on renewable resources. And of course, solar is one of those that is highlighted. So that's one of the reasons why, even though there have been changes at the federal level on energy policy, at the state level, this is still very much of a state goal. In addition, the governor issued an executive order, and what the executive order means is that gives guidance to anybody who is a state official on what type of policy goals the governor is trying to achieve and their responsibility to try to achieve that. And so Executive Order 38, it was enacted by Governor Evers, or issued by Governor Evers, to establish a clean energy target of 100% carbon-free electricity statewide by 2050. So that is a very ambitious goal, and one that would have to be met through the production of renewable energy, whether it's solar or wind or hydro. Those are all renewable energies. And so I wanted to just give you that background to begin with. Moving on to the solar regulation guidance document. As you can see, there's a date of February 10th, 2026. From time to time, we do update it, and you'll see an updated date when we do that. We just did a small update a couple days ago, but it was just to correct a few typos that none of us seem to have seen after going through it about 12 times. And so this is readily available. It's free to you. And again, we'll be sending out links. So in the state of Wisconsin, there is a separation basically in regulation of solar energy projects. And so if it's a 100 megawatt project or larger by state statute, and you see the state statute that's referred to there, Wisconsin statute section 66.0401, the state legislature, because it's the goal of the state to favor renewable energy, they have removed any local government regulation from in any project of that size or larger. And what has been put in place, and I'll talk more about this in just a moment, is a review process through the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. And if you're familiar with the Public Service Commission, or if you're not, it's a 3-member commission appointed by the governor, confirmed by the state legislature, and that commission makes a decision whether or not a certificate of public convenience or necessity, CPCN, will be issued, and for a large solar project to go forward. And I'm not going to use large very often in this discussion, but for a project of that size to go forward, it must receive a CPCN from the Public Service Commission. Because it is a PSC process, there's no local government regulatory approval or authority. And again, as the bullet up towards the middle of the page says, the authority resides fully in the Public Service Commission. That doesn't mean that local governments have no role. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but local governments may participate in the review process. So you can seek to become a party to the process. You can seek to provide comments in the process. And you can also submit information to the Public Service Commission, what your community development plan looks like, those types of things, but you do not have a say as a local government in a project of 100 megawatts or larger. If you're under 100 megawatts, it's a little bit different process. Then 66.0401, again, referring to the state statutes, and always bring my state statutes with me, but under 66.0401, there is limited review authority by local governments. And when I use the term limited, what I'm saying is you don't have the full authority that you otherwise might have for other types of projects. When it comes to renewable energy, it's been limited by that statute and intentionally so by the state legislature. There are court cases. There's one, Ecker Brothers versus Calumet County, that obviously came out of Calumet County, and other case law, and this is all in the guidance document, indicates that local governments with zoning authority, and that's the majority of you that are on the webinar today, can't zone for solar development. So what it means is you can't say in one part of your community a solar development is appropriate, and another one it isn't. And by doing that, have what's known as a one-size-fits-all kind of ordinance. That also means that you can do that in your development plan, indicate that, but you can't have an ordinance that prohibits solar. You can't have an ordinance that says that any solar project must meet these standards. Those types of things are considered one size fits all, and that has been prohibited by the Wisconsin courts. There are some cases that are going through mostly related to wind, but there's a case related to solar that is at the circuit court level. We'll see if that changes, but the current state of the law is that you can't have a one-size-fits-all ordinance that prohibits it, prohibits renewable energy, for example. So what does that mean? That means the court has left open the door for a conditional use permit process. And what that means is developing standards that are based on the specific project in front of the county board, the city council, the village board of trustees, or the town board of supervisors, but it has to be on a case-by-case basis. Once again, and I'm going to probably overuse this, but the court specifically uses language. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all kind of regulation. And I just moved my cursor bar again, and because I did that, I can't advance the slide, so I'll have to move it again. There we go. So under 66.0401, if a local unit of government seeks to regulate a solar development project that's under 100 megawatts, there are three standards. I put them as rules here that must be met. The first is the local unit of government is going to have to demonstrate that public health and safety is being preserved by the ordinance. And so local restrictions, as I noted, are only valid if they directly preserve and protect public health and safety. There's going to have to be evidence behind that. And by contrast, if the ordinance is based on general visual preference or aesthetics, that is not sufficient based on the statute. And I presided over many zoning hearings in St. Croix County. We're looking at a rezoning for a variety of different projects. And we'd have a lot of individuals come in front of us and say, we want to preserve that vista. It doesn't, whatever is being proposed doesn't fit in with the aesthetics of our community. And generally speaking, the zoning committee could consider that. But in this case, the legislature has said, no, that you have to tie it to a specific public health and safety reason. Rule number 2 is if you do that, you do have to also consider protecting siting costs and efficiency. These, by the way, are ors, not ands. So you meet one or the other or the other. But rule number 2 says local zoning or conditions cannot significantly increase the installation operating costs of a solar energy system. So if you put a regulation in place, you do have to consider that the regulations through a conditional use permit, that you're not significantly increasing that cost. Because if you do, then it's going to be subject to being turned over by the circuit court system. You can also not put a regulation in place that significantly decreases generation efficiency. So these are by statute protections for the developer when they're in front of you to say, hey, if you're looking to restrict what we're doing, these are sideboards of a pickup truck that you have to operate within. And therefore, if you go beyond that, there's a good chance that we're going to consider challenging the ordinance in the circuit court, and a good chance then you're going to lose the validity of your ordinance. The third rule is provide an alternative of comparable value. So if your conditional use permit regulation is being applied, you must allow for a viable alternative solar system option, of comparable cost and efficiency. So if not this way, it can be done this way. So you do have to provide that alternative, and it has to be of comparable cost. It can't be one where you can't do it this way, but you could do it this way, but it's going to cost a lot more for you. No, if you do that, generally speaking, Wisconsin court, at least as under the case law that we currently have, is likely to overturn your ordinance. And once again, there we go. And so I've already mentioned the Ecker Brothers case limit, but I'll just talk about that a little bit more here. And these are 3 different types of limits on local government. And again, these are for under 100 megawatt projects. So as I said, in Ecker Brothers, Wisconsin Court of Appeals from 2009 up in Calumet County, you have to review applicants individually. I've said this like 4 times now, but one size fits all standards don't go. Then you have to meet Wisconsin Act 67, which requires substantial evidence. So if you're putting a conditional use permit process in place, it must be based on facts reasonable people accept, rather than personal sentiment or neighbor opinion. So what does that mean? That means, for example, if you're going to require it on a specific project, a setback off the town road or whatever you have, any place that's traveled, so a county highway, although county's going to have some role in that. But if there's going to be a setback, that has to be based on substantial evidence. So that's going to look like having the county highway engineer come out and examine the sight lines and say if the solar project is right up against the right-of-way, that might present some site issues because of the way the topography is, and therefore it's going to be far safer for it to be set back a little bit further. It's that type of thing that you're going to have to do and provide that as evidence. Once again, if it's based on personal views towards renewable energy, I just don't like having this here, or some kind of sentiment, it's not consistent with our community, or neighbor opinions. Once again, the court's not likely going to give validity to that. And if the decision on the conditional use permit is based off of that, that is going to be something that could be readily challenged in the circuit court. Also, then the third box over on approval mandate, if a conditional use permit process has been created by the local unit of government and the developer meets all of those conditions, again, those conditions have to be reasonable, then Act 67 says if all those conditional reasons or conditional requirements are met, then it has to be approved. It must be granted. The conditional use permit must be granted. You don't have the ability at that point to say, no, we acknowledge that you met all the requirements, but we still don't want it here. Therefore, we're not going to grant the conditional use permit. Nope, that's not allowed under state law. So let's move on to the ordinance itself, and just checking my time here. I think we're doing well. And I'm going to break it up into 2 different components. Those that are approved by the Public Service Commission, so I call them CPCN, approved solar development, and that's going to be under a different section of the model ordinance versus those that local units of government still have some limited zoning authority. So just to open it up, from an overall perspective of zoning, and once again, I'm trying to move things around on my screen, but model zoning and permitting ordinances. Let me first just talk about that. For those of you on the call with zoning authority, this is the model zoning ordinance that we at UW-Madison Extension have developed for you. There is a second model ordinance that's being developed for those local units of government. These are going to be towns that are under county zoning and don't otherwise have their own zoning authority. It could be towns that are in counties that have not adopted a county zoning ordinance, but those towns have not adopted the appropriate requirements to have their own zoning authority, which is adopting village powers and then using those village powers to go to zoning. And so there'll be two different ordinances. The one I'm talking about today is the one that applies if you have zoning authority in your community. And as I said, permitting, again, will be coming up later, hopefully within the next month or so. It's always a little hard to predict when you have a review process going on and other parties are involved, but we're trying to get that out as quickly as possible. So once again, this ordinance, the next section I'm going to talk about is really focused on those projects between 1 and 99 megawatts. I did not include language for rooftop solar, for example, because I didn't want that to really make the ordinance a lot more complicated. So if it's solar that's being put on top of a person's home or garage or business, that is not covered in this model ordinance. If you need language, we can certainly find language for you on that, but that again is not covered. As Jesse said, this went through a really robust advisory committee review over a series of months. And I use the term robust because we had lots of opinions and lots of great information that came from the group. And it was the wide majority, well, it's a wide diversity of those that have an interest in this issue. And so it was those who are proposing solar developers, it's those who are critical of solar developments, and everybody in between. So this, what you're going to see once you get the link to it and are able to download it, what you're going to see is basically an ordinance that was developed with all of those interests in mind, but the focus was to try to provide you as local governments with an ordinance that would withstand any kind of court challenge. And once again, this is intended to offer education and training, but not legal advice. Check with your own competent legal counsel. Oops, sorry, it just moved ahead a little bit too far. In section 1.06, and I'm not going to be scrolling through the ordinance provisions because we determined that if we did that, that was one, going to take too long, and two, be too confusing. So I'm going to hit the highlights of the model ordinance. And so you'll see section 1.06 and you'll get these slides. So you'll be able to tie the presentation in with the model ordinance. But the ordinance requires detailed site engineering plans. One of the concerns that we heard from local units of government is that they were notified that there was an application to the Public Service Commission, for example, and they felt kind of in the dark on that. And now this is a little bit different because we're talking about 99 megawatts or lower and the local governments retain authority. But we took that to heart and said one of the things that local governments really want to see and the residents of that local community is information, substantive information about that project. And so, or proposal. So therefore, we require detailed site engineering plans, which includes a scaled blueprint showing layout, panel placement, storage systems, grading, drainage patterns, easements, and fencing. So these are all things that citizens have said to us that these are things that interest them, and they would like to know what is being proposed from the earliest possible moment. And as you'll see in the ordinance, if a proposal is being made in the community, these things are required very, very early in the process. Number two is decommissioning and financial assurance. So the detailed site engineering plans more towards the beginning, but people also said, what happens after the 25-year useful life of the solar array? That's fairly standard. What happens there, particularly if the solar developer doesn't use an automatic renewal provision in the agreement with the landholder? Typically, there's 2 5-year renewal periods. If those aren't executed, then what happens with decommissioning? So we include provisions within section 1.06 where the developer has to provide what we call a concrete plan. That's not meant to be a pun, by the way, but a concrete plan with third-party engineered cost estimates ensuring full site remediation at the end of life. And once again, this is a significant concern both by the landowner and by the community members as well as the local government. So that's why we included that in the proposed or model ordinance as well. Third is environmental and historical baseline analysis. And so one of the provisions within the ordinance is to identify cultural, archaeological, and wildlife impacts and a study if the project sits near a historic site, native tribal lands, or ecologically sensitive regions. And that in some cases will have already been identified in your community's development plan, but this is something that is going to be required if you go forward and adopt this as your model ordinance or something that is similar to that. Also, we included number 4, public notice and soil water testing protocols. And so notifications, of all neighbors within 500 feet. Now you could, and I should have said this earlier, none of these provisions are ones that you just have to accept. You can do some variation to these, but again, there's going to be a reasonable test. And if you take notification of all neighbors within a mile, that may be viewed by a court as being unreasonable. So we put in 500 feet. We think that's very, very defensible. Baseline on soil and water testing, so that there's a baseline there so that if there are any concerns about any type of water contamination or any soil issues, that we have a baseline, and as well as the clear ongoing monitoring procedures while that solar array is operating, just to make sure that there is no degradation of the environment that is occurring as a result of the solar array. And once again, I started moving things around. There we go. From a co-locating energy and agriculture perspective, that's also in section 1.06. Municipalities, so counties, cities, villages, and towns, are legally permitted to encourage dual use layouts. So you can propose to maintain agriculture underneath that solar array while producing energy. There are going to be reasons why the landowner, if it's not actually the solar energy developer, but if it's a local farmer or some other type of rural landowner, they're probably going to want to maintain some type of agricultural practice to maintain use value taxation on that property. If you haven't heard that term before, use value is the method of valuing property and determining what its value would be for property tax purposes based on its useful activity. And I'm going to use this term, it's a preferential property tax rate. It tends to be lower than if it's classified as another type of use. And so it's typically quite beneficial from a financial perspective to maintain or to obtain use value taxation of that land. Some of the potentials which are listed in the ordinance is livestock grazing. And there's a lot of research. Those of us who are in this RESET collaboration have had some opportunities to go out and visit sites to see some of this in action. But a lot of research is being done on integrating sheep, in some places even cattle or chickens, in part to manage vegetation growth beneath the solar arrays, but also to allow for production of agriculture. By the way, I live in Greene County. We have a lot of goats there. Goats are not recommended because they do eat pretty much everything. And so please don't think about goats as being one of the forms of livestock that'll be grazing. And I happen to know that from firsthand experience. Conservation planning. There's a lot of research being done to try to ensure that the solar array is not going to interfere with native pollinator species. So to ensure that there's still a really good environment for bee and butterfly habitats. And we saw some examples of that as a collaboration over in Stoughton a couple of weeks ago. Some pretty interesting research that's being done on that. And then finally, soil preservation, restricting grading on high quality prime agricultural soils and ensuring long-term vegetative cover. And we want to ensure to the extent possible that high quality prime agricultural soils are preserved. And so that is one of the provisions in the ordinance for the developer to say how they're going to deal with that and disclose that to the town board or county board or city village council. And also ensuring long-term vegetative cover to make sure that we don't have any erosion of soils from any type of water, because as you can imagine, with a solar array, there is some impermeable surface. And as the water comes off the solar array, it's gonna be concentrated in a more, sorry, I'm gonna use this term twice, concentrated area. And so to plan for that so that we don't have an issue with that. And I'll just point out on a personal level, my dad was a soil and water conservationist with USDA. So it's something I tend to think about a fair amount. Moving on to road protection requirements. And again, as someone who served as a town official and as a county official, we want to ensure, again, this is for projects under 100 megawatts, and this is included as provisions in the model ordinance, that there are road protection requirements. So structure pre and post construction inspections to ensure that there hasn't been any material degradation of the roads that lead to and from the solar array, that there is a process for formal haul route approvals, And so that if there is a preferred route because the route is able to withstand greater loads, that is what's brought in as part of the conditional use permit process. And then again, this is not a pun, but concrete developer-backed financial bonds for physical road restoration. And if I heard nothing else as a county board zoning committee chair from town boards, is they had developers who damaged roads. And how is the county, because everybody was under county zoning in St. Croix, how is the county going to make sure that there is compensation for the towns for their town roads? So this is all covered in provisions in the model ordinance. Also, we cover sound and lighting. And so we do put on strict limits matching state standards, particularly on sound. And that's in part during the construction period. And then any operational noise from the solar array must not exceed industry thresholds. I've not heard much in the way, if any, of complaints on the solar arrays that are in the state of Wisconsin, but we do include those as provisions so that there is a commitment between the developer and the local governmental body. And where possible, there is a directive within the ordinance to use quieter equipment, positioning, and if necessary, physical barriers. Moving on to physical barriers, setbacks, and fencing. It's really flexible setbacks designed, once again, on a case-by-case basis. If you have in your ordinance that there's a mandatory 1,500-foot setback for any solar array, once again, court's likely to overturn that, say that's not allowed under the state statute and the case law that's in place right now. But you can do that on a conditional use permit basis, but it, once again, has to be reasonable. But the town board can, or the county board, or the city council, or the village board can, if they can support it with facts, determine that a specific type of setback is required, and we have that flexibility written within the model ordinance. We also encourage wildlife permeable fencing, woven wire, in some cases above a certain level from the ground so that livestock will still be kept in, but the native animal species will be able to go underneath and continue to travel through. And once again, that is covered and is tied to the DNR standards. Moving to safety and setbacks. And once again, way here for battery storage systems. There is most likely going to be a separate model ordinance that we will prepare for battery storage systems. As you may be aware, battery storage systems are becoming much larger, and there's good reason for that, because as the sun produces energy into the solar array, the developers, to the extent possible, because the sun doesn't shine all the time, obviously, is maintain that energy within a battery storage system. There are some issues related to safety and setbacks, or I should say potential issues with the larger batteries in particular. And so we have requirements within, or proposed requirements within the model ordinance on storage systems must fully comply with National Safety Code, UL's Uniform Laboratories, 9540, and then NFPA 855, but those standards, and if you need links to those standards, we can get those to you, but it's meant to mitigate risk of fires or hazardous leaks. So these are safety standards to help ensure that that doesn't happen. There are setbacks in this area, and these are specific setbacks from homes, schools, businesses, and drinking water systems. And you'll say, I thought you just told us that we can't do specific setbacks. Well, this is different. This is under battery storage systems. That's not regulated in the same way under the Wisconsin statute, again, 66.0401. And so this is in one area where we can have more of a specific setback that is set within the ordinance. From a lifetime and containment, moving over to the right side of the slide, dual containment. So the structural enclosure around that battery storage system must be signed to capture 150% of battery unit volume. So if there's any leakage, then any leakage of the potentially hazardous chemicals will be fully maintained, and even to a level that's higher than what's actually in those batteries, to make sure that there is no runoff into any of the surrounding area and any damage resulting from that runoff. Also, from a life cycle limits perspective, there's mandatory removal and recycling of the battery containers at the end of the useful life, or a maximum of 7 years. And that is a provision that's also included in the model ordinance. This is one area that is likely to be subject to the most change as technology on battery storage continues to develop. And so this will be a work in progress. And certainly if any substantial changes are made in this section of the model ordinance, we will get notice out to everyone. Moving to state permitted systems. So this is for the larger. So what I just got done talking about, as you all know, was for the under 100 megawatts. And now I'm going to talk about over 100 megawatts. And this is in section, it should be 1.05. Sorry, there is a typo there on the screen, 1.05. My apologies for that. But the developer, at the time that they are putting the application into the Public Service Commission, they are required under the PSC process to also file notice with the local units of government. But this makes it very formal and very clear that the local ordinance requires a notice of intent to construct. And that is, the notice must be filed within 5 days of starting a PSC application. So if that PSA application goes in, then within 5 days, there has to be a formal notice to the local unit of government. And that is to make sure that there is not any kind of surprise for that local unit of government, because I have heard complaints as a local government attorney here at Extension from boards saying that we didn't know about this until it was already quite a ways along in the PSC process. I can't make a judgment as to whether something got missed there, but this just helps to make sure that that coordination of communication happens. Then the developer under this model ordinance must file an identical copy of the state application to the Public Service Commission with the local unit of government. So all the information going into the PSC, you're also going to get as a local unit of government. And then as part of that, to map all the infrastructure and local road use proposals. So you don't have the ability to put conditional use permits on this, but you know what's being proposed to the Public Service Commission related to infrastructure and local road use. And so once again, this is really meant to significantly up the amount of information between the developer and the local unit government and the citizens represented by that local unit government. And as a quick aside, I'll note that I was the head of the state's Consumer Protection Agency for 6 years at the Wisconsin Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. I literally reviewed thousands of contracts between businesses and citizens, consumers, and where the disputes were most likely to occur was where there was a lack of transparent information. And so this is really meant to provide as much transparent information as possible. And if that happens, I think the potential for miscommunication and then controversy coming out of that miscommunication will be significantly reduced, or at least that's our goal. So hopefully that's what happens. Then roll haul route and emergency plans require structural planning of haul routes, pre-construction video logs of roads, and fire EMS coordination for emergency shutoffs. And these are things that, at least to date, we have not seen either the courts or the Public Service Commission say thou shall not or cannot do this as a local unit of government. So we've included this in as provisions for, once again, the CPCN permitted solar energy arrays, which are, once again, 100 megawatts or larger. Then we also included provision on pre and post-construction GIS, government information system filings requiring high accuracy GIS maps, so you know where it's being proposed, and that's within completion, within 90 days of completion as well. And it includes making sure that the local unit of government knows who the site manager is, with frequent updates, so that if there is a problem, the local unit of government knows who they can contact right away to try to take action to alleviate whatever that issue happens to be. And I move my cursor again. Sorry about that. Let's move on to part 3, which is voluntary developers agreements. And this is separate from the ordinance. I've already talked a lot about Wisconsin Statute 66.0401, which places limitations on local government. This is your opportunity, or an opportunity, to go beyond what state statute allows you to do as local units of government. And that is to develop voluntary developer agreements. And there's really good work being done by the Center for Land Use up at UW-Stevens Point. I think there's at least a few of you that are on the call today that are getting out a lot of information on voluntary developers agreements. And this is a contract. And I teach contract law, so this area that I'm really interested in. But this allows you to go beyond state statutes and to provide for things that you believe are necessary for your community that the developer is willing to agree to. Again, because it's a contract, there has to be two willing parties to this. And if one of the parties is not willing, you're not going to be able to force a voluntary developer agreement on that solar developer. That's, again, why this is called voluntary. So there are certain provisions in here. One, or not provisions, excuse me. There are certain aspects to this. One is, as I said, you can bridge law gaps using the contracts. And once again, this is governed by contract laws. And one of those is enhancing financial resources. So if you want to get a larger payment from the solar developer, and in many cases, we've heard that they are willing to negotiate that. You can negotiate higher. It's supposed to be direct annual payments. I just found my second typo. Jesse, hopefully you're tracking those too. But sorry about that. But you can then mitigate impacts on local tax levies or to fund special community projects like a new park or enhancements to a park. One of the things that I've been doing work in is trying to figure out if a solar array goes into a specific school district, for example, what effect does that have on the ability of that school district to continue to draw out of the equalization fund that is set up for school districts. And there could be a potential negative impact based on whether or not, if it's a project that's under 50 megawatts, for example, the local assessor is going to be assessing it, and the valuation may go up or down, most likely up, but if that valuation goes up, then the school district's going to get reduced equalization payments. Will that offset any increased taxes that come from valuation? And sorry, I just made that probably a little bit more complicated than it should have been. But if there is evidence that there's going to be a negative hit from a tax collecting perspective for the local unit government, this is something you can negotiate with the developer. And the developers are very often willing to discuss this. And once again, there can be other things like you want to have the developer contribute to a new town hall or to a fire truck or to an ambulance. These are payments that you can negotiate. You can also negotiate extra neighbor buffers. So you can secure additional visual screening, tree planting, or larger setbacks. Again, we're bound by the conditional use permit process. It has to be reasonable. And I don't want to suggest that longer setback might be otherwise unreasonable, but if it's going to keep the neighbors happy, solar developers typically are going to be willing to negotiate that, as long as that tree planting or that larger setback doesn't deny them then the useful use of the property that they've either leased or purchased for their solar array. Also, from a joint protection perspective, you can establish pre-construction video inspections for haul routes and include timelines for full road restoration. And so these can go beyond what you have in the conditional use permit. Once again, it's a contract, and as long as two parties are willing to negotiate and agree to that, these are provisions that can go beyond state law. Said differently, there is nothing in state law that says you cannot negotiate for something that goes outside the limits of state law. Finally, we'll talk briefly about comprehensive plans. As you all know, communities are required to have comprehensive plans and to update them. Again, a shout out to the Center for Land Use up at Stevens Point, UW-Stevens Point, because they do a lot of great work in this area, work with communities across the state on comprehensive plans. And so we very much appreciate our partnership with them. And so as part of that comprehensive plan process, once again, if it is a CPCN permitted solar development, so 100 megawatts or larger, just as a reminder, the PSC must determine if a project unreasonably interferes with orderly local land use. One of the ways that the PSC is going to try to determine that is to look at your comprehensive plan. And so if you've updated your local comprehensive plan with language related to solar, where you think solar might be more appropriate, you can't prohibit it in your community. But if there's an area that is more suitable as opposed to other areas because it's environmentally sensitive or it's right next to a large subdivision, whatever that happens to be. If you update your comprehensive plan to indicate that, the PSC can take that under guidance. They're not required to act as a result of your comprehensive plan, but there is a provision in the review process where they can take that into account. And even though it's not 100% clear that they will act on it, it's way better than not having anything in your comprehensive plan addressing this issue. Also, you can identify as part of that, and I already alluded to this a little bit, but identify environmentally sensitive lands. So you can map your waterways, historic watersheds, tribal lands to justify why specific areas may be unsuitable for solar arrays. And this creates what we call a defensible baseline. It's always way better to point out what's suitable within your community and what's not suitable in your community before you have a proposal. Because if once you have a proposal and then you try to amend your comprehensive plan, that is going to be looked upon with suspicion, either by the Public Service Commission or by the local or by the circuit court. So it's way better to address this in advance. Once again, avoid blanket prohibitions. I know I've said that a number of times, but I have to keep emphasizing that. There are ordinances that I've seen across the state which local communities are using, which put on blanket prohibitions. And I'm not going to provide them with legal guidance or advice. That's not my role. That's up to their attorney. But I am concerned that if there was a challenge of that ordinance, that might be overturned by the local circuit court. And so once again, stay away from avoiding blanket prohibitions of solar within your comprehensive plan. And once again, there may be very suitable areas within your town, a brownfield, underused property that might be very suitable, and you can direct that then away from some of your prime soils, because if you have a strong agriculture community, agricultural activity within your community, and you want to make sure that's not undermined by removing a lot of great soils, that is one way to do that through the comp plan. Once again, a blanket municipal plan will likely be overturned. Don't do that. And sorry if I'm the messenger on that, but that is just reality. This last slide, again, I'm moving things around on my screen and I can't, there's my cursor. Sorry, this was a little awkward, but this is the link if you want to go and find both the model ordinance as well as the guidance document. And there's lots of additional information as well. It's go.wisc.edu/reset. And once again, we'll be sending out this information at the conclusion of this webinar, so you'll get that way as well. Finally, there is my contact information. If you do have questions, welcome questions either by phone or by email. Email is probably the best way, one, because then there's a record of it, and two, because I travel a lot across the state teaching local governments, and so that's probably the most likely way to track me down. So with that, I believe we have 11 minutes for questions, and I will turn it over to, I'll keep the screen up for now, if that's okay, in case we have to go refer to a specific slide, unless Jesse or Katie, you want to do that differently, but I will ask them for then any questions that might be asked. And again, if you have questions, please put it in the chat.
Thank you so much, Bill. That's wonderful. And we did receive a couple of questions and we got some as direct messages, but if anyone has other questions, please start putting them in the chat now. And so the first question that came through to Katie is, would you say, Bill, for the health and safety subcomponent of 660401, is a reasonable way for local governments to assess whether their regulation of solar for health and safety is reasonable or supported by substantial evidence is a comparison with the Wisconsin PSC siting standards. So there was an example of the noise context. Could you paste that in the chat sheet, Katie? Because I think I didn't do the best job with that. So if you could check that out in the chat, Bill, that's a question we've received. We also received the question, can CUPs be limited to specific zone districts and prohibited in other zoned districts? So those are the first two. Thank you.
Yeah, so I took it off a share screen so I could see the chat a little bit better. So
great. No, that's perfect.
Okay, so I'm just reading that. So what is a reasonable way for you to provide that evidence that you need to support a health and safety aspect or foundation for your ordinance? And already offered one way is to have the county highway commissioner come out and do site checks and determine whether or not a specific setback might be reasonable or not based on the topography, based on the road usage, based on the road design in the local community. Having that outside expert come in and do that assessment, I think it's very helpful to have a third party that would be recognized as someone of having expertise on that health and safety aspect come in and advise you. And if you're a town with zoning authority, the county is a good place to go to get that. Of course, as a county, a city, village, you may already have those individuals on staff, so you have staff support. But then if you have a third-party consultant that would also come in and provide support for that, that would probably be one of the best things that you could do. Again, the more you can document the factual foundation for the health and safety aspect to your ordinance, the more likely a court is going to uphold that. If sorry, I'm going to repeat this, but if it looks like it's based more just on public opposition, and so you're just throwing sorry, I don't mean to demean anybody or anything, but if you're throwing up a whole bunch of things on the wall, hoping that something's going to stick with the court, that's probably not the best way to go about writing your ordinance. And then there was a question though related in that question on noise. And so a condition that would require 55 decibel volume would seem reasonable. Again, you're going to want to have a third party come in and check that. I actually live in a town where there is a question right now about the amount of, and there was a conditional use permit for a business in the town, which happens to have live music on weekends. And there are complaints about the decibel level of that live music. And the town is going out to get third-party assistance to determine, one, what is the decibel level, but is the standard that was set reasonable? Because if it is a reasonable standard, and they believe it is, and the business owner is exceeding that significantly, they're going to have to bring regulatory action. And they know that they're going to likely end up in circuit court if that happens. And so once again, it's good to have it, to the extent you can, some outside expertise brought in to help you. As far as the specific decibel level, I don't know that I can speak to that, although I used to enforce decibel levels for the state of Wisconsin. It's head of consumer protection. Human speaking, it's entirely possible that a court might decide something is higher is reasonable. I don't know where that difference is going to be, but there is some both subjectivity and objectivity to that. Hope I answered that question at least in part. I can't give you a full answer to that one. The second question, for either scale installation, can conditional use permits be limited to specific zone district and prohibited in others? So that is a tricky question. And typically speaking, the guidance that we're currently giving based off of the court cases as well as the statute is don't limit solar to a specific zone. So zoning district within your municipality, because that is going to look by the court is going to look at that with suspicion and determine that you're really trying to prohibit that. And what's a scenario I'm thinking of? That zone where it is allowed might be extremely limited in size. And so a solar developer is going to say it's not possible to get an economically feasible solar array in that small area within your municipality. And it's pretty clear that the reason you're doing this is just to block this or block any type of renewable energy project. So that, again, that is that you're going to I'm going to caution you to not decide in your zoning ordinance that solar is only possible in specific zoning districts. Again, your comprehensive plan is an area where you can decide where it's more suitable in certain places than others. But given the current state of the law, I think there's a good chance your zoning ordinance would be overturned. Third question, what are the statutory requirements for an adoption of a moratorium? That is an interesting question. So in Calumet County, that was a challenge of Calumet County Board of Supervisors' attempt to put a moratorium in place. There seemed to be evidence in the record in Calumet County where Calumet County was really putting it in place to block the Ecker Brothers solar development. And but in my discussions with the attorneys, with the counties association, we take the position that it's not prohibited to do a moratorium, but it has to be reasonable in length. And you have to, during that time period, show evidence that you really are trying to come up with a reasonable ordinance regulating solar or wind energy development projects within that time period. So if you set a 2-year time limit, that's pretty clear, or would be pretty clear to a court that you're just trying to block it. But if you're setting a 6-month or a year, because that's a typical time process for getting an ordinance developed, drafted, and through your review process, that is less likely to be overturned by a court. But if there is evidence that the moratorium is meant to block it, a court is very likely to overturn that. Let's see, going to the fourth question, how do you recommend schools proceed in negotiating and make them whole in terms of a loss of property tax? But since the county is negotiating, well, I'm a school board president. Sorry, you've gotten too much of my bio here. So this is something that's near and dear to my heart as well, is you need to have the county, you need to talk to the county and say, if it's the county or if it's a town, if it's town zoning, and say, please take our interests into heart as you're negotiating with this. And if possible, to be invited in on the negotiation and to get payments above what you might miss out on the difference between equalization and valuation. And I will once again say that is really, really complicated. I have a background in property tax protests, appealing property taxes. We do all the training for boards of review, and it is very complicated. So that is, it's going to be complicated to figure out what that tax impact is, but if you can't figure it out, that is something you can negotiate and try to keep the school district whole as much as possible. Next question, can adjoining municipality, in this case a city, block access to the site? Driveway access proposed site is in the town, is on a city road. Oh, interesting question. Haven't gotten this one before. For a smaller project. And it depends on why access is being denied. Is it for safety reasons, health and safety reasons, where there is supportable evidence of that? That is one thing. But if it's being blocked because the municipality, the city in this case, doesn't want it to happen in an adjoining town, that is something entirely different. That is, once again, something you would want to talk about with your own legal counsel to figure out, because this is going to be very fact specific or fact dependent, and you'll want to review that with them. Next question, can the authors of model ordinance speak a little more as to where the guidance of maximum 7 years for useful life battery storage systems projects comes from? That is, at this current time, best practice. And that comes from a lot of different studies that have been done. Again, this is relatively new technology, so this will be continuing to develop. But from all of the different interests that participated in the review process for the model ordinance, 7 years was the consensus that was developed. I will fully admit I'm not an expert on battery storage systems. I'm getting more expert, I'm not expert, but I'm getting more knowledgeable about it. But I'm looking at Jesse. Jesse, you have your hand up. I'm quite sure you're going to offer some additional information on this.
Well, I just did a control F of the ordinance bill, and I don't actually see 7 years in there. I think we might have removed that because of a back and forth discussion about whether it made sense because the technology is. So actually, thank you, Peter and Nolan, for flagging that. And to your point, I think if you review the ordinance, you'll find we don't include the 7-year replacement requirement that was put in.
That's right. We took that
counties.
Out. So yeah, we had that in, took it out, and I'm looking at the actual draft or the actual final. It's not in there. So my apologies for that. Thanks for pointing that out.
We can update that. And then I think we have time for one more question. This has been so great. I think there was a question about
public notice requirements for moratorium. So if it's a county, if it's a town that's governed by the public notice requirements, there are different requirements. And there's even different requirements based on the town, whether you're using the local newspaper as your publication of record. Again, refer to your local attorney, your attorney for your town board or your county board or your city or village, and they can get that. We can get that for you too. But again, you have to meet those specific requirements. If you don't, you can have your ordinance overturned. So I don't want to misstate anything in the last 10 seconds that we have of this webinar.
And thus concludes on time our webinar about the model solar zoning ordinance.